Let's take you back to our top story that just released. Pandora Papers, as they're being called, a collection of nearly 12 million files published by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Now, let's recap what I said earlier. It's exposing a lot of offshore deals concerning all kinds of world figures and leaders, among them the monarch of Jordan, close allies of Pakistan's Prime Minister and a former British Prime Minister. Let's get reaction out of Europe with Rory Challands in a moment. But first, let's speak to Mike Hanna in Washington, D.C. Mike, let's start with the revelations of what's being termed as a property empire amassed by the Jordanian monarch in the U.S. as well as the U.K.
Yes, indeed. The papers report that King Abdullah used shell companies to obtain a number of properties in Europe, in California, in the U.S., and indeed here in Washington, D.C., property in Georgetown, it is alleged. Now, one must make very clear at the outset here that no wrongdoing is being attributed. The King Abdullah's lawyers have already written to the publishers of these documents, making very clear that there was no attempt to hide these shell companies from public view, though, of course, there may be a domestic impact within Jordan itself, given the fact that these sums were being spent while those within the country were arguing about the economic situation. But the fact is that the King Abdullah did use shell companies, according to the papers, to obtain a series of properties in various parts of the world, spending money in excess of $100 million, it is said. I must state, too, as well, that these investigations have been compiled over 18 months. Now, the results are going to be released on a daily basis, focusing on some of this massive trove of documents. Now, also mentioned in the documents is the fact that the U.S. is becoming something of a tax haven. That points to South Dakota, for example, where tax laws have allowed a number of international figures to secrete funds. Once again, there is no wrongdoing necessarily alleged. The fact is that the facts of what is happening are simply being pointed out in these papers. Perhaps as more details follow, we will be able to follow up and see what the precise nature of tax havens in a state like South Dakota is and what it actually means for the Biden administration, which has made very clear that it wants to stamp down on the use of offshore currencies to avoid taxes. Here, the possibility that a U.S. state may be used for precisely that purpose.
And we've also got a question about how damaging the revelations might be for politicians in Pakistan. Take us through that, Mike.
Well, there you've got a number of politicians allegedly close to the country's leader who, once again, have used shell companies to put money into various entities around the world. Now, once again, this was, according to the papers, conducted in secrecy. I keep on stressing, though, whether there was wrongdoing involved or whether this is tax avoidance rather than tax evasion, that is something for the courts to decide. But a large number of those said to be close to the Pakistani leadership are involved in this. But it's not just limited to individual countries. The papers attribute such tax activities among more than 35 heads of state, prime ministers, kings throughout the world, ranging from the leader of Kenya to the leader of Azerbaijan. So this is very widespread throughout. It also is going to provide details on the tax avoidance or evasion activities of more than 300 government leaders, ministers in various governments, officials in various public companies. So this is a massive document drop, far greater even than the Panama Papers from a few years ago, certainly far wider with far greater detail, it would appear, than emerged in that particular drop of data, which led to the resignation of a number of politicians around the world. But just to introduce another caveat that my colleague in London is likely to pick up on too, for example, you have former Prime Minister Tony Blair and his wife. Details are provided of a tax avoidance scheme in which he saved some £300,000 on the purchase of a property belonging to a Bahraini politician. Now, this was done by avoiding stamp duties. It is pointed out in the papers that this is not an illegal action. However, it points out, too, that it's a type of tax avoidance scheme that is not available to ordinary citizens and requires a far greater organization and far greater contacts to be able to set it up. But I must stress as well, the point being made here is that this is not necessarily illegal. It may not look that good, but it is not, at this stage, criminally indictable. And there are many cases along these lines in the papers that we have seen to date, but there's going to be much, much more detail revealed in the days, weeks, possibly months to come.
All right, thanks so much. That's Mike covering that end of this story. Let's continue this with Rory Challands in London. Rory, Mike kind of segued us into the fact that the UK at the centre of many of these revelations. Take us through some of them.
Yeah, well, of many European names that are going to be coming out of the Pandora Papers, there are a number of prominent ones. One of those is President Zelensky of Ukraine, who, interestingly, when he was campaigning to get that office, he was very critical of his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko, an oligarch, and criticised him for squirreling lots of money in offshore accounts, asset classes, etc., taking that offshore. It appears that Zelensky has been doing something not completely dissimilar, that together with a group of associates, friends from his former TV days, he had been participating in an offshore system that allowed him not to declare various assets that he had. And he also, it seems, transferred a 25% stake in an offshore firm to one of his friends. Mike was just talking there about Tony Blair and Cherie Blair, who managed to avoid paying thousands of dollars worth of property tax when they bought a multi-million-pound London building by acquiring an offshore firm from the British Virgin Islands. Now, this is not illegal, but it shows you really that if you have the money and the connections, you can find a way of getting around a tax that most other Britons have to pay as a matter of course. And I think the UK's role in all of this is very difficult to understate, because the UK has a huge number of lawyers, experts, accountants, etc., who are very, very knowledgeable, about the offshore system, and are only too happy to take the money of the world's wealthiest people to allow them to hide their wealth. And that is something that the UK has long been known for, and these Pandora Papers are putting, again, the spotlight on the UK's financial services and its property and its property sector as a way for lots of rich people around the world to basically hide dodgy cash.
All right, well, this is based on almost 12 million documents, so we'll let our guys go through all of this now, and we'll come back to you later. I'm sure there's a lot more detail for us to pick up on. Rory Challands there.